There is a topic in knitting, I'm guessing in crochet as well, but in knitting in particular, that can be fraught with fraughtness. I don't know what I'm saying. Fraught with fraughtness. That's not even a word. Hey all y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie. This is where I talk about knitting, my tips, my tricks, my opinions, my preferences, my experiences, and my experiments of making pretty things with pretty string. There are a few topics in knitting that can be quite controversial, but one that can certainly elicit gnashing of teeth, rending of shirts, and very strong feelings is gauge swatches. Yes! Yes, I'm hearing noises. I'm hearing noises. I'm imagining noises. A lot of people see a gauge swatch as kind of a waste of time and yarn. They feel like the gauge swatch is the thing that's in the way of doing the really fun thing in knitting, which is casting on the project. And for a lot of people, they feel like a gauge swatch just lies to them anyway. So why put in the time and the effort of knitting this little piece of square cloth, rectangular cloth, to see if you're getting the same number of stitches and rows per inch as what's called for in a pattern? I used to be that knitter. There was a time in my life where I would sort of almost resentfully do gauge swatches because I guess I was supposed to and that seemed to be the rule, but I wasn't really sure if it was helping me out at all. But as it turns out, the gauge swatch process wasn't really the problem. It was sort of my own lack of knowledge on how to do a good, accurate gauge swatch. And since learning how to do better gauge swatches, I've actually found that the process saves me time and saves me yarn.
What?
I know. That seems counterintuitive, but hear me out. You don't end up casting on a project where at the end it's too big or it's too small, or even being partway through and realizing, wait, this doesn't look right. Now I'm gonna frog the whole thing out and start knitting again. The other thing is a gauge swatch really gives you the opportunity to audition a yarn for a project. Sometimes even if you buy the same yarn that's called for in a pattern, turns out you don't like that yarn for whatever reason. You want to do something else. And believe it or not, especially if the gauge swatch is calling for you to swatch in the stitch pattern, it gives you a chance to practice that stitch pattern and find out if you even like doing it. You might get to the end of a gauge swatch and realize, I don't want to make this after all. So hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, give this video a thumbs up, and find out my top tips for working a gauge swatch. As we get started with today's video, as always, a quick reminder that down in the description box, you will find timestamps to different parts of the video if there's a topic you want to jump in immediately. Of course, I always hope that you'll watch through the whole video at least one time, because you never know what neat tip or trick or just a funny moment that will be in the video. Also down in the description box, you will find a list of resources and materials I think are relevant to today's video. Some of these will have some clearly marked affiliate links. If you clicked on this link, it'll take you to a place where you can do some shopping, and if you make a purchase, I might then earn a small commission, which really does help support my channel. I love providing these resources and having these conversations with the knitting and fiber community, but it does take time, resources, and coffee. So if you'd like to help me out, if you'd like to help a knitter out, the affiliate links are there, as well as my Ko-fi, and you can use a super thanks. And if you utilize one of these, thank you so much. It is so greatly appreciated. And regardless, I'm just so glad and appreciative that you are here watching a video today. Okay, let's get on with the show. Let's address the super chunky yarn in the room, which is when or if gauge swatches are necessary. For me, my rule of thumb is 1, is doing a gauge swatch, the amount of yarn that I'm going to use in a gauge swatch, less than the yarn that I would use if I just started casting on and knitted about like 6 inches of the project. If the answer is yes, then yes, I will do the gauge swatch. But if the answer is no, then I might skip it. For example, these gloves, if you have been to my channel before, you may recognize these. These are the Cottage Path fingerless gloves. I only had one skein of this yarn, and I was a bit concerned like that if I knitted a gauge swatch that I would run out. But the main reason I didn't knit a gauge swatch was this was a pretty small project. I cast it on with a larger set of needles, the recommended needle size in the pattern, and when I got about 6 inches up the cuff, I was kind of looking at it going, I don't think this gauge is right. I did a measurement, and it convinced me even more that I needed to go down a needle size, which I did, and I was thrilled with the tension that I ended up knitting these two. And I don't feel like I wasted time or wasted yarn, and I don't think a gauge swatch would have benefited me in this instance for this type of project. And that's often the case for me when it comes to projects like socks, fingerless mittens, sometimes hats, that the amount of time and yarn that I would utilize to knit up a gauge swatch, I could get the same information that I need just by starting the project. The other time that I may just go ahead and throw caution to the wind and not knit a gauge swatch is if I'm working a project where fit isn't important or when the final size of the project isn't my primary concern. I might just go ahead and risk it. And sometimes it works out really well for me. Sometimes I'm a little disappointed. For example, this is another project that if you've been following my channel, you know a lot about. I've been talking about it. It was featured in my kind of 2021 wrap-up, and this is the Amberine Wrap by Amy Snell. And I really enjoyed working this project. It was such a good time, but I do kind of regret that I didn't go ahead and do a gauge swatch before I started working this. And that's because as beautiful as it is, I didn't get the length of this wrap that was called for in the pattern, and I now realize I really wanted. And that was just a risk that I took. I wear this wrap. I wear it more like a scarf. I still love it, and I'm probably gonna work this project again with a bigger set of needles so I get another one of these at more the length that I want. But the fact is, had I done the gauge swatch, I could have ended up with a project right off the bat that got me the size that I want. But there are other instances where I do think it is absolutely essential that you knit up a gauge swatch. And the most obvious situation is when fit matters. If you are knitting a garment of any type, whether it's a vest, a sweater, a cardigan, what have you, and you really want it to fit the way that you want it to fit, you're going to need to knit that gauge swatch first. So I recently started working a pattern, June Blooms by Knit Eco Chic. And this project really hits all the reasons why I would want to swatch. One, it's a garment. I want the fit to turn out correctly. And two, I'm doing a yarn substitution, and it is a yarn that I haven't used before. The other time that I will at least seriously consider doing a gauge swatch is if I am substituting yarn for a project, especially if I'm kind of messing around with the fiber content of my yarn substitution, because fiber content can really affect the gauge and how the fabric will behave as time goes on. And a gauge swatch is a way to get a clue into whether the yarn that you have chosen is appropriate for the pattern that you're trying to pair it with. I think a lot of us have had that like anxiety when it comes to swatching, which is, will I have enough yarn? Has the designer sort of factored in the amount of yarn you need to do the gauge swatch into how much yardage they say you're going to need for a project? Let me just say that most designers, yes, they do factor in enough yarn for you to do a gauge swatch and the pattern, but I still always have that doubt in my mind. And the way that I have overcome sort of my feeling of like, oh, I might run out of yarn. Oh, it's a waste of yarn is whether I'm purchasing yarn on spec or I'm purchasing yarn specific to a project. I buy a ball of yarn that I think of as my swatch skein. It's the skein that I designate for swatching, that's for me to play around with, especially if it's a yarn that's new to me or a fiber that's new to me. It's kind of nice to just knit up a little bit of a swatch sometimes, sort of a low stakes way to try it out and see what the yarn does and how it behaves. So yes, have that swatch skein. Size matters when it comes to swatching. In fact, the bigger, kind of the better. One of the things I was reminded of when I was doing the level 1 master hand class is that as hand knitters, we are not machines. So not every single one of our stitches is going to be absolutely the same size the way a fabric made for machine knitting is. All right. However, we do have an average tension, and that's what the gauge swatch is about. It's about finding out what is our average knit tension. So with averages, right, the bigger the sample, the more accurate the average is. Same thing is true with the gauge swatch. So my tip is to aim to knit a swatch that's going to be about 6 by 6 square. And the reason I say 6 by 6 is if your tension is too tight and you end up with a smaller swatch, you're still going to have a nice sizable swatch to measure. And if your tension is too loose, well, you're going to know real quick that that swatch is bigger than 6 by 6. You're going to be able to visually see what's going on. So this pattern that I'm working, June Blooms, calls for 20 stitches and 28 rows per 4 inches. So I wanted to knit a swatch that would hopefully end up being 6 by 6. So to figure out how many stitches to cast on, I took 20, divided that by 4, then multiplied that for 5 stitches per inch. I multiplied that by 6 to get 30 stitches. To figure out my rows, I divided 28 by 4 and got 7. 7 times 6 would be 42 rows. So for my gauge swatch for this June Blooms, I casted on 30 stitches and I worked 42 rows and, hoped that by the end of the process, I would have at least close to a 6 by 6 square. So here is the swatch that I worked for my June Blooms project. Right after I was done working it, I put in this waste yarn. I placed it about 3 stitches away from either edge and 3 rows away from the cast on and bind off. Why in the world am I doing this? This helps me know where to do my measurement. As I said before with knitting, we are not machines, and so there are slight variations that will occur from one stitch to another. But there's also areas within the knitting where your stitches can be a little tighter or a little looser than the average stitch within the work. For a gauge swatch, you really want to avoid measuring the stitches that are right at your cast on, your bind off, and to either edge. I aim to measure 3 stitches in from either edge and 3 rows in from the cast on and the bind off. And usually that gives me a really good place in the middle of the fabric to measure the number of stitches I'm getting per inch. I will see people to this day who will have a gauge swatch and they'll pull out their ruler and they'll put their ruler down and they will only count the stitches for 1 inch. This is not enough stitches to get an accurate average. You want to be able to count as many stitches as you can, at least 4 inches of stitches, in order to figure out an accurate number of stitches per inch. So to just kind of recap, top tips when it comes to measuring is make sure that you are measuring the stitches in the middle of the fabric. Make sure that you are counting at least 4 inches of stitches. I love knitting hats, and I used to dutifully knit a gauge swatch for my hat, and I'd measure it, I'd be like, great, I hit gauge, I'd knit the hat, and it would end up giant. It'd be too big. And I'd be like, what am I doing wrong? Why is this lying to me? What? Turns out I was making a really common mistake. I was not working my gauge swatch in the same manner as I would work the pattern. If your pattern is worked flat, you knit your gauge pattern flat. If you are working a pattern in the round, like a hat, an in the round sweater, sock, etc., then you need to knit your gauge swatch also in the round. There's various reasons why your knitting tension will vary between knitting in the round versus knitting flat. A really big one is that when we purl, oftentimes our purl stitches are a little bit bigger, sometimes a little bit smaller, but often a little bit bigger than our knit stitches. Here's the thing though. Knitting a large enough gauge swatch in the round that you can get a good like 4 inches to measure your stitches requires a pretty large in the round swatch, and you're almost at the point where you might as well just go ahead, especially if you're working a hat, you might as well just go ahead and work the hat. But there is a way of knitting a swatch in the round where you don't actually knit in the round. It's called a simulated knit in the round swatch, and I do have a video about it. I will link it up here and down in the description below. It's a neat trick to be able to knit a swatch kind of flat, but it gives you an idea of what your in the round tension is, and you don't use as much yarn as you would if you were knitting a swatch, like a true swatch in the round, because honestly at that point you might as well just go ahead and knit the sleeve or knit the hat, like, because like, yeah. Oftentimes, gauge will be given in a pattern in stockinette, and stockinette curls, and measuring a garment with curl can be a little bit tricky, and so sometimes people will knit a border around their gauge swatch to take care of any curl that might happen with the fabric. I highly recommend not doing this because the stitches that are going to be right around that border won't be good, accurate representation of your average stitch tension. You're going to have to knit a bigger swatch in order to get a solid number of stitches in the middle to count. So I think it's just not worth doing a border. The other thing I want to throw out there in terms of doing an accurate gauge swatch is to slow down and relax. And again, a lot of times we feel this need to get through the gauge swatch as quickly as possible because we want to just get to the fun part. And the fun part is casting on our stitches and knitting the project. But if you try to knit faster to get through the gauge swatch, that's not going to necessarily be an accurate representation of your tension when you're knitting the project. And again, the point of a gauge swatch is to have a small sample of what your knitting will be when you're doing the project. So slow down, relax, knit as the same way you would as if you're doing your project, and keep in mind that when you're knitting your gauge swatch, you actually have started the project. It is the first step in the project. And personally for me, I'm not saying this is going to help you, but for me, keeping that framework in mind that I've started the project when I start my gauge swatch really helps me relax into it. It's a part of the process. It's a valuable part of the process, and it's a part of the process that is just as important when I do gauge swatch. It's just as important as when I do the full body of the project. A lot of times people will knit up their gauge swatch, they'll measure it, as soon as they won't bind off, they'll just measure what's on their needle, say, hey, I hit my gauge, and then take it off the needles and frog the swatch, and then use that same yarn to start the project. And that way they don't feel like they're wasting their yarn, and they don't have to worry about what to do with the gauge swatch after it's done. There is a huge problem with that method. Huge. Washing and blocking affects your gauge, or at least it can. How much washing and blocking will change the gauge of the fabric kind of depends on a lot of factors. So many factors. But there's a better than good chance that after you bind off your swatch and you take it off your needle, throw it in some water, and then lay it out to dry, there's a better good chance that your gauge will change. Also, of course, blocking can make a huge difference to your gauge. Now, let's just briefly hit on this, just briefly about blocking. What people are talking about can actually differ from knitter to knitter. So when I talk about blocking, I talk about it in the sense of blocking is what you do after you've washed the item and you've laid it out flat to kind of give it its final shape. And sometimes that could be a very light blocking, and sometimes it can be a pretty aggressive blocking with pins and really stretching the fabric. I have a video where I actually went through a bit of a blocking process with 2 projects. If you'd like to see a little bit more about what that process can look like, and I will link it up here and down in the description box below. But I bring all this up because how you plan to finish your project can affect your tension. The project can really grow through the blocking process. It can also shrink up sometimes through the wash and block process, but you won't know how your fabric is going to respond to it until you do it. So for my June balloons project, after I was done with the swatch, I went ahead and washed it. And after giving it a good pat dry, laid it out on my blocking board and had to decide how I wanted to proceed with blocking. Now I'm working with a yarn that is 50% cotton, 50% silk. It's plant-based, so I would expect this fabric to grow somewhat over time. But my main consideration is the fact that this project is a stockinette-based project, which means it's going to have a tendency to curl. So I decided to go ahead and do a pin block because even with a plant-based fiber, a pin block can kind of help take some of that curl out in the end. So simple. After unpinning my gauge swatch from the board, let it rest a day. I know it's like, wait, really, that matters? Yes, believe it or not, that can really matter. When your swatch has been pinned out, it is under a certain amount of tension, and when you take your pins out, depending on the yarn that you're using, it might recover some from that pin blocking. So it might shrink up a little bit more, or it might relax and grow a little bit more. You won't know until you just let it rest for a day. This was a tip that I learned while I was going through the level 1 master hand knitting program, and when I learned it and I started applying it, my gauge swatches became so much more accurate. I definitely have had swatches, more so with wool, but I definitely have had swatches and fabrics where once I have let it rest for a day, the size of my tension changed like a half stitch or a quarter stitch. And I know that may not seem like a lot, right? You're like, what does a half a stitch matter in gauge? But it actually matters quite a bit. It's basic math, and I'll show you right now. I can show you right now. So let's say, hypothetically, I'm knitting something and I have a gauge of 4 stitches per inch and I have to cast on 100 stitches. How many inches can I expect the width of the fabric to be? Well, I take 100 and I divide it by 4 and I get 25 inches. So that's 25 inches, okay? Let's say my gauge, when I measured it, came out to 4.5 stitches. 100 divided by 4.5 is 22.22222, but it's about 22.25 inches. So I have a narrower fabric because of that half a stitch. What about just a quarter of a stitch? Just a quarter of a stitch. 100 divided by 4.25 is about 23.5 inches. So I'm a ½ inch off now. Actually more than that. So I'm like 1.5 inches off. And so the changes, the half stitch, the quarter stitch change that can occur between the time that you've cast it off, you washed and blocked, and then you let the fabric rest can make a big difference to the final outcome of your fabric. Through my blocking process with this gauge swatch, I will take measurements at different points in the process so that I have an idea of how the fabric is responding to each stage. And that just kind of helps me later on when I'm working the project and I'm measuring things out. It helps me know if I'm in the right place, if I'm in the ballpark of where I'm supposed to be. So for my June Bloom gauge swatch, my pre-block measurement was 22 stitches per 4 inches, which was about 5.5 stitches per inch, and I had 37 rows per 5 inches. But my pattern calls for 20 stitches per 4 inch, which means that I'm getting too many stitches per inch. If I had only looked at my measurements after I had taken the swatch off the needle, I might have thought I needed to go up 2 needle sizes, but I hadn't washed and blocked yet. So after washing and blocking, I ended up with 21.5 stitches per 4.5 inches. So about 19 stitches per 4 inches. That was after washing and blocking. So now it looked like I needed to go down a needle size because I needed more stitches per inch. What to do? Well, that's going to lead me to my next tip. We've all heard of the story of the person who knitted the cotton sweater that became the cotton tunic that turned into the cotton dress. Some yarns just seem to grow with time, and that really has to do with a couple of things. One is gravity. As you wear a garment, gravity pulls down on it, just like it pulls us down to earth. It pulls that fabric down to earth. So when you are doing your gauge swatch, in order to have a final item that keeps its relative shape and size, it's not a bad idea to try to account for the effect of gravity on your fabric. And the way that you can do this is with a hang test. So I took my swatch and I hung it up on this pant hanger that I added additional clips to. And because I was using a tubular cast on, I was able to take a chopstick and poke that through the cast on so I could then attach these clamps for added weight. Swatches tend to be pretty light, and you want to be able to get a sense of what the fabric is going to do when it's a larger piece and weighs more. Once that was all set up, I just hung it in my closet and let it hang there for a day, letting gravity do its thing. It was my fourth and final measurement, and this was my fourth and final gauge, right? My final assessment of what my gauge was going to be with the needle that I chose, and I had 21 stitches per 4 inches and 32 rows per 4 inches, and that was a needle size too small. So going through this whole process, I learned pretty quickly that I needed to go up a needle size for my June Blooms project. And at that point, I had to make a decision whether I wanted to just go ahead and cast on, feeling really confident that that was going to be the correct needle size, or if I should knit another gauge swatch. I've actually decided to knit a second gauge swatch, but I probably won't go through this entire process with the second gauge swatch the way I did with the first one. And the reason is because I've taken all these measurements as I've gone along, I have a pretty good idea of how the fiber is going to behave once the project is done, after I've washed it, after I block it, after it's had a little time to like let gravity do its job, I have a pretty good idea of what that fabric is going to do. And having worked my gauge swatch, I can see that I am on target for getting the 20 stitches per inch that I'm looking for that project. One thing with gauge swatches is there is sort of the quandary if you go through this whole process of what do you do with them afterwards. I personally have gotten into the habit of labeling them. I actually have labels that I use that I tie on to the swatch, and I write down on the label what the yarn is, what the fiber content is. That way I don't have to remember having a ball band, what needles I used, what project that gauge swatch was made for, and I file it and I keep them. It's a nice reference if I want to use that yarn again, that type of yarn again for another project. I can look at that swatch as a reference and go, oh yeah, there's that quality about it, there's that quality about it. I got this kind of gauge with that needle size at that time. Maybe that will lead me to the correct needle size to use for this other project. The other reason it can be really nice to keep those gauge swatches is that it's like a little bit of yarn reserve for you. Let's say you're getting to the end of your project and you are running short. You can always unravel that swatch after you're finished and use that yarn. But also, if later on in life something happens to your project and you need to do a repair, your gauge swatch can be a source of having the original yarn to do that repair with. Now, some people don't want to save their gauge swatches like that, and how you choose to handle that is totally up to you. That is a matter of personal preference. There are people who utilize those swatches for different types of projects, and I'm going to leave some links down in the description box that to some things that are some creative ideas of what you can do with gauge swatches later on. So those are all my tips and tricks for today's video. There's probably more things I could talk about, but I think that's those are the major ones. And if that all seems like it's a major process to go through, it is. I'm not going to lie. It is a bit of a process to go through with a gauge swatch. In fact, that June Blooms gauge swatch took me about 4 days from the time that I cast it on through knitting, washing, blocking, hanging it. It was about a 4-day process. But in the end, I saved time and yarn by going through that process because I did learn I need to go up a needle size, and now hopefully when I do cast on to start knitting the main body of the work that I'm not going to have to frog it back because I realized, you know, hundreds of stitches through, thousands of stitches through that my gauge is wrong. But I'd love to hear from you. What for you makes having a gauge swatch worth it? Are any of these tips or tricks ones that you have used or plan to use moving forward? And I would love to hear your tips or tricks for how to do a good, accurate gauge swatch. Please let me know down in the comments below. One of the great things about having a community here on YouTube is we get to interact and talk and share this information back and forth. And as I always say, I have learned so much from all y'all. So please let me know down in the comments below. And of course, ask me any questions you like. If you have any other questions about knitting gauge swatches or swatching anything, please let me know down in the comments below. You never know when that might inspire a future video. I hope that you enjoyed today's video and got some great information out of it. If so, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your other knitting friends. Liking videos, sharing videos, commenting on videos even does help YouTube know that this is a space worth checking out, and then it recommends me to other knitters and we can keep growing this community together. If you have not already, please make sure that you are subscribed and you hit the notification bell. Hitting the notification bell will make sure that you get alerted whenever I upload a new video or start a live stream. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this. And as always, happy health and happy making. Bye.